I'll give you 1,000 euros if you serve me in Spanish. The millionaire mocked, sure she wouldn't have the courage to stand up to him. But one single phrase was enough to turn the tables and change both of their lives forever. The Riverstone restaurant's dining hall buzzed with ambient music, the clinking of silverware, and the aroma of truffles and imported wines. Sarah Johnson walked with firm steps between the tables, balancing a tray with 2 bottles of champagne and 3 main courses. Nothing escaped her sharp eye. A napkin out of place, a smudged glass, an impatient customer. That was how she survived: precision, patience, and a healthy dose of invisibility. That night, however, she felt the air shift. A round table in the center of the room began to draw attention. Men in suits, Swiss watches, and cell phones discreetly laid on the table. The kind of group that made arrogant requests and left generous tips just to forget how unpleasant they were. Among them, Diego Fernandez, a name Sarah had already heard whispered among the managers. European, billionaire, partner in half the world. Handsome, if you liked men who looked at the world as private property. She approached with a professional smile and notepad in hand. "Good evening, gentlemen. May I take your order?" Diego didn't even look up from his phone. One of the executives muttered something in French and laughed. Another leaned toward Diego and whispered in Spanish, "Go on, make the bet. $200 says she won't understand a word." Diego smirked, snapped the menu shut with a sharp click, and finally lifted his eyes to Sarah. His voice was loud, his accent deliberately drawn out. "Voy a pedir el filete porterhouse poco hecho. Y asegúrate de que el vino no sea de la selección de basura de la semana pasada. ¿Lo entiendes, cariño?" Smirks and chuckles, 1 or 2 uneasy glances. The trap was set. Sarah stared at him for a second, as if digesting more than just his words. For a split second, the dining hall seemed quieter. She breathed, straightened her shoulders, and replied without raising her tone. "Por supuesto, señor. Un filete porterhouse poco hecho y un vino que no ofenderá su extremadamente delicado paladar." Pause. A dry silence fell over the table. Sarah leaned in slightly, keeping her composure. "¿También le gustaría una guarnición de respeto? ¿O eso está fuera de su menú esta noche?" The words cut across the table like a suppressed gunshot. One of the executives coughed, another widened his eyes. Diego opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Calmly, Sarah jotted down the order and finished. "Enseguida vuelvo con su pedido. Caballeros." She turned and walked away with the same elegance she had entered, leaving behind a cloud of shame and silence. In the kitchen, all eyes turned to her. One of the waiters, who had seen everything from a distance, let out a low whistle. "Damn, Sarah, you just crushed Fernandez." "He deserved it," she replied, washing her hands as if rinsing off the energy of the scene. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated Sarah. The difference was that night, she was far too tired to swallow it quietly. Later, in the locker room, between uniform changes and worn-out bags, the comments exploded. That guy's table froze solid. He went pale, like he was about to cry an apology. And that final line? "It's going to be legend around here." Sarah gave a small smile, sitting on the bench, removing the pins from her bun. It wasn't meant to be a legend. It was just to remind him that arrogance doesn't buy dignity. The manager made no comment about the incident. He knew that if he said anything, he'd just add fuel to the fire. Deep down, he hoped Diego would never come back. But Diego wasn't the kind of man to accept humiliation, especially not in public. The next day, the previous night's scene was already circulating among the staff, retold with increasingly dramatic flair each time. Sarah tried to keep her head down. She had bills to pay, a teenage brother to take care of, and overdue rent. She had no time for fights with wealthy men. But something had changed. For the first time, She wasn't invisible, not to Diego Fernandez. Diego Fernandez was not a man accustomed to feeling small. Since the age of 22, everything he touched turned into power. Acquisitions, startups, real estate, people. His words were rarely questioned. His last name opened doors, and his presence usually made the room bend. But for 3 days now, a waitress's phrase had echoed in his head with uncomfortable clarity. ¿También le gustaría una guarnición de respeto? The words haunted him in the shower, in the car, in the silence of his hotel room overlooking the Angel of Independence. It wasn't just the flawless Spanish. It was the tone. The surgical precision of someone who hadn't needed to raise her voice to slice his ego in half. For the first time, someone with nothing to gain from contradicting him had treated him with the exact measure he deserved, and it hurt more than he imagined. On Wednesday night, Diego walked back into the Riverstone restaurant, this time alone. He wore a navy blue blazer and wasn't smiling. He greeted no one. He went straight to the reservation desk. The hostess recognized him instantly. "Table for one?" she asked, tense. "Yes, preferably in the corner, somewhere discreet." She nodded quickly, leading him to a table away from the central area. Sarah didn't notice when he walked in. She was in the second hall, taking an order in French for a Belgian couple. She only realized when she returned to the kitchen and heard a waiter whisper, "Fernandez is back, alone this time." She paused for a moment, thought about asking someone else to wait on him, but the truth was, avoiding the situation wouldn't change anything. She took a deep breath, grabbed her notepad, and walked to the table with the same professionalism as always. When she stopped in front of him, Diego looked up. For the first time, he seemed human, more tired than arrogant. "Good evening," she said, neutral. "Good evening, Miss..." He hesitated. "Sarah." Her tone was clipped. "Sarah, right. I would like to have dinner. No bets tonight." She wrote without smiling. "Would you like the menu in Spanish or Spanish?" Diego hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "Spanish will be fine." The conversation ended there. She took the order and walked away. No irony, no lingering glance, just distance. During the meal, Diego observed without seeming invasive. He watched Sarah attend a group of tourists in fluent Spanish, then a French family with the same ease. She was quick, precise, polite, but there was something more. A firmness in her posture, a discreet authority that didn't match a waitress's uniform. She owned that space as if she were a partner, even while earning minimum wage. And even after what had happened, she walked among the tables with her head held high. No attempts to please, no signs of submission, and that disarmed him. At the end of dinner, Diego asked for the check. He handed over his card with an automatic gesture. When the bill came back, he discreetly wrote in a generous tip. 10,000 pesos, about 500 euros. It wasn't meant to humiliate. In his mind, it was a way of saying, "You won." But Sarah returned to the table with the same calm expression and handed the money back, neatly folded. "Mr. Fernandez," she said, looking him in the eyes, "thank you, but I don't work for charity." He tried to speak, but she went on. "This," she lifted the envelope discreetly, "doesn't pay for what you did. And it doesn't buy what I do." Diego swallowed hard. For the second time, she had disarmed him. No yelling, no rudeness, just a firmness he had never known. She stepped back, maintaining her elegance. "Have a good night?" "Sarah," he said, for the first time without arrogance, "you're right." She didn't answer. She simply turned and walked back into the dining hall. On his way out, Diego passed through the doorway under the curious gazes of a few waiters. He said nothing, didn't look back. Outside, he drew a deep breath. For the first time in a long while, he had no idea what to do. In the car, the driver asked for the destination. "Just drive for now." He stared out the window as the city moved around him, fast, alive, indifferent to his discomfort. Her image, the firm gaze, the direct tone, the way she ignored him without contempt, wouldn't leave his mind. For the first time, he saw someone who wanted nothing from him. And that was new. 3 weeks. That was how long it took for Diego to be seen as more than the arrogant man behind the bet. He didn't try to force closeness. He kept coming back to the restaurant at different times, always requesting tables away from the center, and he observed in silence. Sometimes he read, sometimes he just looked around, always alone. Sarah noticed. She noticed everything, but she didn't give in. Diego wasn't the only persistent customer, but he was the only one walking on eggshells. And that, in a way, set him apart. One Friday night, the restaurant was packed. Sarah rushed between a table of diplomats and another of influencers trying to film their own dinner. As she passed Diego's table, he called out to her, not arrogantly, but almost as if asking for permission. "Sarah, can I talk to you? 5 minutes, just talk." She glanced at the clock. Her break was coming up. She sighed. "In the back, near the kitchen, if it's quick." The staff break room was a cramped square, with an old table, 2 lockers, and a coffee machine that groaned every time it was used. Sarah entered with the posture of someone who knew exactly what she wanted. Boundaries. Diego was already waiting, standing, leaning against the wall. No blazer this time, just a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. A wealthy man, yes, but now visibly unsettled. "Thank you for hearing me out." "I haven't said I'll listen yet," she replied, crossing her arms. "You've got 5 minutes. Talk." He took a deep breath. "I was an idiot. That night, I acted like I owned everything, even other people's dignity. It wasn't just disrespect. It was cruel. It was a bet, with money, on my intelligence." Her voice was firm. "It's not just arrogance. It's a rotten structure that taught you could play with people like me." Silence. He didn't disagree. "You don't know what it's like," she continued, "to wake up every day, put on this uniform, be invisible, be treated like a robot, like a distraction, like furniture, and still have to smile, because if you're rude, you lose your job." Diego lowered his eyes. "You're right. And I grew up in a world where everyone smiles when I make mistakes, where no one tells me no. And when you did, you put me in my place. I didn't put you anywhere. You just never got knocked off the pedestal. You tripped a little, that's all." He chuckled lightly. For the first time, a laugh that wasn't asking for an audience. "I deserve that." She looked at him for a few seconds. The tension was still in the air, but something had started to shift. At the very least, he was listening. "Why do you keep coming back here?" she asked directly. "At first it was pride. I wanted to show you I'm not the jerk you saw. But then," he hesitated, "I started realizing there's something here I've never found in the places I go. Truth. Real people. You." Sarah looked away. "I'm not some humility trophy, or a case study for a rich guy in an existential crisis. I know. And I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to talk, to understand, maybe even to learn." She stayed silent. For the first time, he seemed more curious than convinced, more vulnerable than superior. "Can I ask you something?" he ventured. She nodded, slowly. "You mentioned once that you spoke Spanish because of college. What were you studying?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She hesitated. It wasn't a subject she liked to touch. "Languages, with a focus on translation and linguistics. I wanted to work with languages, teach, translate books." "And why did you stop?" She drew a deep breath. "My father died. My brother was little. My mother broke down. Someone had to pay the bills. I dropped out, moved to the capital, Got a job here. And here we are. Diego didn't know what to say. He felt a strange knot in his throat. For the first time, he saw the line between survival and dreams, and understood how thin and fragile it could be. How old is your brother? 15. He studies in the morning, works at a tire shop in the afternoon. We manage. Diego nodded, but said nothing. Nothing he could say in that moment would feel right. Sarah stood. You listened. That's already more than I expected. Now, if you want to keep coming here, fine. But don't try to fix what you don't understand. Don't try to buy what you never lost. He nodded again, without arguing. She left the room. He stayed there for a few minutes, staring at the coffee he hadn't touched. That night, Diego left no tip, no note. He just paid and walked out. For the first time, he left the restaurant with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain. The woman he had once tried to humiliate was making him more human. And as much as it hurt, he didn't want it undone. The gossip began the way all gossip does, with a sideways glance, a half word, and a meaningful pause between two employees in the locker room. He only comes here because of her, right? Of course. Ever seen a millionaire hanging around a restaurant for no reason? Something's going on. For sure. She pretends it's not, but... And that was it. Enough for the rumor to be born, to grow, and within days, to spread like smoke on a dry day. Sarah sensed the shift before she heard the words. Co-workers who used to share jokes with her grew colder. 2 waiters laughed when she walked by. The hostess avoided eye contact. Distrust was taking shape. The following Wednesday, the manager called her in for a private talk. Sarah, I need to speak with you. Please close the door. His tone was serious. The manager's office was small, the desk buried in papers, and the air conditioner rattling too loudly. Some concerning comments have been brought to me about your relationship with Mr. Fernandez. What kind of comments? She asked, her voice icy. Comments suggesting personal involvement, improper benefits. And honestly, it's hurting the restaurant's image. Are you suggesting I'm doing what exactly? He hesitated. I'm not suggesting anything, but we need to preserve the environment. And if this continues, I may have to take measures, including reconsidering your employment here. Sarah stayed silent for a few seconds, swallowed hard, her stomach twisted. Then let me make this clear, she said firmly. I have no involvement whatsoever with Mr. Fernandez. He came here, disrespected me, I stood up to him. He came back. That's all. Even so, nothing. You're about to fire me over gossip, over misogyny disguised as professional environment. Sarah? He tried to justify himself, but she was already on her feet. If you're going to fire me, do it looking me in the eyes and with a reason that holds up. But don't accuse me of something that only exists in the minds of people who can't stand to see a woman being respected by a wealthy man without assuming she's on her knees for him. She left the office with her heart racing, her face hot. Barely noticed the movement around her. Went straight to the locker room, grabbed her bag, and marched to the executive boardroom. She needed to speak, to defend herself. But when she opened the door, someone was already there. Diego. The restaurant's executive room was rarely used, normally reserved for partners' meetings or expansion decisions. That day, seated around the table were the manager, 2 directors, and the company lawyer. And at the center, with impeccable posture and a serious expression, was Diego Fernandez. Sarah froze in the doorway, startled. "Please, come in, Sarah," said one of the directors, clearly unsettled. She stepped inside slowly, not fully understanding what was happening. "We're here because Mr. Fernandez requested an urgent meeting. About rumors," the manager explained, now far less confident. Diego stood. "Let's set the record straight. I've been a silent investor in the Riverstone Group since last year. I invested in this restaurant not for quick profit, but because I believed in the concept. And also because I trusted the integrity of the people working here. He looked directly at Sarah, then back at the others. Miss Sarah has no involvement with me. I disrespected her. Publicly. And I came back here out of shame. Because she taught me something many people with MBAs and private jets never could. She was my conscience when no one else dared to contradict me. Absolute silence. Whoever spreads rumors isn't worried about the restaurant's image. They're bothered by the fact that a young, intelligent, and firm woman had the courage to put a powerful client in his place, and now they're trying to punish her for it. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mr. Fernandez, this is delicate. It's not delicate. It's obvious. If this company considers itself modern, diverse, and ethical, then this employee should be protected, not threatened. Sarah stood still. Her heart pounded. Anger and relief clashed inside her. I didn't ask for this, she said, breaking the silence. Diego turned to her. I know, but it needed to be said, and no one here seemed willing to say it. She looked at him for a few seconds, then turned to the board. So, will there be repercussions or not? The lead director cleared his throat. Sarah, of course not. The situation was misinterpreted. You'll continue with us without any warning. Good. She turned to leave, but paused at the door, looked back at Diego. Thank you for the truth. But do me a favor, Mr. Fernandez. He nodded, waiting. Don't use your money to protect me. Use it to change what allows this kind of abuse to happen in here. Because tomorrow it could be another Sarah, and she might not have anyone to speak up for her. Diego didn't respond right away. Then, with gravity, he said, Understood. That night, Sarah returned to work. The kitchen was quieter, the glances more cautious. No one dared comment, but everyone knew. Something had changed, and this time, it wasn't Sarah who bowed her head. Time passed, and with it, the murmurs in the restaurant began to fade. Diego Fernandez didn't show up for weeks. Some thought he had given up. Others, that his conscience had finally settled. Sarah? She simply kept going. Shift after shift, tip after tip, as if the city demanded twice the effort from her just for existing with dignity. If there was any scar, she didn't let it show. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday night, Sarah was wiping down the bar counter when the manager approached. He was nervous, holding a folder, sweating despite the air conditioning. I need you to go to the event hall. There's a presentation from the foundation that's now our partner. They're launching an initiative with the investors. And what does that have to do with me? They're calling you by name. Sarah frowned. She set down the cloth, washed her hands, and went. When she entered the reserved hall, she saw a few chairs, a small podium, and a banner with the foundation's name, Aurora Institute, Education for Women Who Transform. Diego was there. No suit, no arrogance. Just standing beside a foundation representative, his expression serious and restrained. The room went silent when Sarah walked in. Good evening, said Diego, holding the microphone. I'll be brief. He looked at her but spoke to everyone. Throughout my life, I've invested in business, in technology, in real estate. But I've never invested directly in people. Not for lack of opportunity, but for lack of courage. He paused. A few weeks ago, I made a mistake. A public, personal, shameful mistake. I was arrogant, disrespectful, and I was taught a lesson in humility by someone who had nothing to gain, but still chose to keep her dignity. Sarah felt the eyes turn to her. She stood firm. That person made me realize that power without purpose is just vanity, and that making amends isn't done with flowers or empty apologies. It's done by creating paths. He turned toward the screen behind him where the logo of the new initiative appeared. Sarah Scholarship for Women Starting Over. A short video played, showing images of women studying, caring for children, catching early buses, working at supermarket checkouts, libraries, hospitals. Diego returned to the microphone. Starting today, the Aurora Institute is launching the Sarah Scholarship, aimed at low-income women who had to pause their studies for survival. The first scholarship carries the name of the person who inspired me to create it, and she has priority to accept, if she wishes. Silence. Sarah crossed her arms, breathing deeply. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just waited. When the room dispersed, she went up to him. "So that's what this is now?" she said, facing him. "You wash away guilt with a scholarship?" Diego didn't look away. "No. I understood that I can't change what I did, but I can transform what I do from here on out." "Why my name?" "Because you showed me what it means to give up your own dreams just to keep the world running. Because you taught me something no one in my circle ever would. And because I wanted this scholarship to be about dignity, and dignity is what you represent." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "That doesn't change the fact that I was humiliated in front of a table full of men. I know. Or that I almost lost my job because of gossip. I know that too." She studied him. "Do you really think a scholarship erases that?" Diego shook his head. "No. But maybe it opens doors for other women. And maybe it's only the beginning of what I should have been doing with what I have." Sarah took a deep breath. "I don't need charity." "And it's not," he replied. "It's structural reparation. It doesn't carry my name. It requires nothing in return. And if you want to refuse it, that's fine too." She turned, walked a few steps, stopped, thought, came back. "I'll accept." Diego blinked, surprised. "But with one condition. Anything. No meetings, no personal messages, no direct ties. I'll study for myself, for my brother, not for you. And when I graduate, it'll be because I fought, not because someone handed me a shortcut." Diego nodded, respectful. "Then we have a deal. And one more thing," she added. "Don't just create this scholarship. Create others, many, with the names of other women no one sees, because I'm just one. And there are thousands." He smiled for the first time that night. "That's exactly the plan." That night, Sarah left the restaurant in silence. The city's wind was cold. The bus would take a while, but she didn't mind. At the bottom of her bag, she carried a brochure from the Aurora Institute. And in her mind, for the first time in a long while, she carried something she had almost forgotten, the possibility of choice. Not because someone saved her, but because, despite everything, she had never let herself be broken. Sarah always sat in the front row of the classroom, almost always with dark circles under her eyes, almost always with a cheap coffee in hand and a heavy backpack on her shoulders. But she sat upright, attentive, as if every minute there was too precious to waste. The public university was far from the restaurant, but she managed. Reduced shifts at work, sleepless nights, weekends spent studying. Sometimes she went straight from class to the market, then rushed home to cook dinner for her brother. The days were long, but now they had meaning. On the wall of the small bedroom she shared with him, she had taped a handwritten note in black marker. "It's not about deserving, it's about making it count." Diego Fernandez remained involved with the Aurora Institute, but, as promised, without invading Sarah's space. No out-of-context invitations, no attempts to get closer. Only occasional messages about the scholarship's progress, foundation events, and sometimes links to articles on education or social mobility. She always replied politely, brief, clear, no openings. "He texts you?" asked Aline, a co-worker at the restaurant. "Sometimes." And nothing. He's just a man trying to do the bare minimum. And now he knows that doesn't make him special. Respect had been established, but so had distance. Months later, The institute organized an event to launch new scholarships in other cities. The auditorium was small but full. There were cameras, photographers, journalists. Sarah was there, sitting quietly in the back with other students. She didn't want to go on stage. She had already played her part. Diego appeared on stage with Catherine Morgan, the foundation's director. Simple clothes, no security detail, no fanfare. His speech was direct, without embellishments. At the end, a reporter approached him, microphone in hand. "Mr. Fernandez, what motivated you to create the scholarship named after Miss Sarah?" Diego paused. He could have spoken about numbers, about impact, about institutional image, but he chose something else. "She was the one who taught me the value of doing something by merit, not by name. I just followed the example." The reporter tried to push further, but he ended the interview with a gesture and slipped away discreetly. From the back of the room, Sarah heard the phrase. She didn't smile. But inside, she knew. He understood. Time passed. By her 6th semester, Sarah landed an internship as a translator. It was remote, poorly paid, but legitimate. Gradually, her shifts at the restaurant grew fewer. Until one day, she turned in her uniform. The manager, now with a different posture, thanked her for her time there. He didn't ask for explanations. He just wished her luck. She walked out the front door, as always. But this time, with both feet firmly on her own path. Diego and Sarah still crossed paths at foundation events, interviews, or education forums. Always cordial, always respectful. Never more than that. Once he saw her present a panel on higher education inclusion. She spoke with clarity, firmness, without apologizing for existing. On the way out, he greeted her. "That was a strong talk." "It was meant to be," she replied. "You've become a reference." "No. I just had the chance to keep being who I already was." He nodded. Understood. Years later, in a classroom, Chloe, a student, asked Sarah, now graduated, now a professor, if she believed people could truly change. Sarah thought for a moment. "Yes, but only when they realize they're not the center of the world. That dignity is not negotiable. And that power without humility is just noise." They followed different paths, with no debts, no promises, no ties beyond respect. Sarah rebuilt her life on effort and choice. Diego learned to use his name to open doors for others, and no longer as an excuse to trample them. Their story didn't become a romance. It didn't become a soap opera. It didn't become a fairy tale. But it became truth. And that was more than enough. And you? What did you think of this story? If this story made you feel that dignity is never negotiable, write respect in the comments. That helps spread the message. And if you'd like to support even more, leave a like and subscribe. That way we can keep sharing stories that matter.